Welcome to 4 Women, 4 Decades Life Lesson Conversations. In this series, we're talking to people from around the world about the lessons they've learned that have helped them see life and the challenges that they face from a new perspective. And today I'm talking to David Evans, who is also known as GreyFoxBlog. And David was a lawyer for 25 years. He's been married for 42 years. He has 2 children and an 11-month-old granddaughter who I'm sure he's utterly devoted to. In 2002, he had a major cycling accident which nearly led to a below-knee amputation. He used this as a driver to change, having never really enjoyed law. He retrained as a teacher and taught in primary for a few years before then becoming a tutor. While teaching, he started the blog, which is now almost a full-time pastime, not a career in the sense that it earns very little. It gives him the chance to be creative in many ways and to meet people that he'd never had the chance to meet in previous careers. The blog is about his search for personal style, and as he says, he has no background in fashion, style, or menswear. David, thank you for joining us.
It's a pleasure, Rebecca. It's lovely to see you again.
I'm so happy that you agreed to have this conversation, because although we're 4 Women, 4 Decades, what we share is universal, and we just want to get as many kind of different perspectives as possible. Yes. And as we were talking before we started recording, this is just about sharing what you've learned in those kind of key things in your life that have given you a different perspective.
Yes.
So I'd love you to kick off, really, and I guess maybe it's around that, having been a lawyer for 25 years, that accident, which actually I didn't know anything about, I hadn't realised that's what had happened, and then the change that kind of flowed from there. So kind of over to you to start off.
Yes, sure, yes. Well, in my previous life, until 25 plus years ago, I was a lawyer. I qualified as a solicitor, and I practiced for 25 years, the last few years on my own. And I never sort of felt totally comfortable in the law. I never enjoyed it completely. I think I was sort of from that generation where parental expectations were such that, you know, I went to private school, and the parental expectations were probably that I was going to be a lawyer or a doctor, or an accountant or something like that. And it turned out that I was a lawyer, and I never really particularly enjoyed that. But then, yes, in 2002 it was, so 18 years ago, I was cycling to see a client, and I had a fairly major accident where a bus turned left in front of me, and my right foot was crushed under the bus, basically. And I was in hospital for weeks, and 9 operations later, and sent home at Christmas with the prospect that I might have to have a below-knee amputation on my return. Luckily I didn't, because of all the cycling I'd done, I was incredibly fit, and the blood supply to my foot sort of re-established itself, and all luckily was fine, and I recovered. And afterwards, I suppose I went through all the sort of trauma that one goes through after an accident like that, including probably a certain amount of depression looking back on it. But I decided that here was I in a situation where my practice had come to a halt because I hadn't been able to work at it for some months. I was in a job I wasn't particularly enjoying. I thought, well, you know, these 2 episodes come together at quite an opportune moment, and give me an opportunity to do something new. So after I recovered, I decided, I looked around and thought about things I'd like to do, and I'd always sort of enjoyed working with children, enjoyed teaching. So I thought, okay, I'll qualify as a teacher. So I went off to our little local university here, which is St Mary's in Twickenham. I think it's the smallest university in the country. And I did a PGCE and qualified as a teacher, and taught in primary for a few years. I probably would have liked to have taught secondary, but to teach secondary, you have to have a relevant degree, and a law degree doesn't really throw open many opportunities in secondary teaching. But primary was great because you teach all the subjects from PE to RE. You're the class teacher, and children of primary school age on the whole tend to want to learn as well. So it's quite a sort of pleasant, constructive atmosphere. So I trained as a teacher and taught for a few years, as you said, which, do you want to ask me another question at this stage? Because I'm just sort of talking and I'm not really quite...
No, that's absolutely fine. That's absolutely fine. So what happened then? Because you taught for a few years, and I don't know how old you were then, so whether you know, but... It would
have been mid-50s. I'm 65 now, so yes.
Right, okay.
Yeah. So I taught for a few years, and teaching primary is quite hard work, and I was teaching in a single form entry school, so each year group was just one class, which meant that the teacher in that class had to do all the planning and all the preparation work. Whereas if you're in a primary school with 2 or 3 classes in each year, then those 2 or 3 teachers can share all the preparation and the planning. So I found it a huge amount of work. I loved working with the children, but just the bureaucracy and so on in the end made me think, well, is there some way I can continue to teach but without this sort of burden of administration and bureaucracy? So I started to tutor from home. I did that for a few years, and I really enjoyed that, teaching one-to-one, often with children, you know, with learning difficulties and so on. And it's a very constructive way to teach. You haven't got all the problems you have in a class where you have 30 children with a huge range of abilities, and somehow you have to differentiate your teaching for all those children, often on your own and with very little sort of teaching assistance. So I enjoyed that, and it was while I was doing the tutoring that, for some reason, I can't quite remember why I did it. I think I'd always felt I had a book in me and I wanted to do some writing. This was nearly 9 years ago now, and I thought a blog would be a great way of practicing some writing. But the next question was what I was going to write about.
Yes. And what I love, and one of the reasons we were talking about this before we pressed record, one of the things that I can't even remember how we connected, but it was certainly on Instagram. And I remember when we first had a conversation, which must be going back 6 years ago, maybe 5. I can't remember how long you've had the blog, but maybe 5 years or so ago. And having that conversation with you where, you know, I mean, certainly you didn't have the number of followers you have now, which is extraordinary. But it was this conversation about you'd got to, never having experience of, you know, fashion or even personal style or anything like that, was this, well, I'm at that age where I either put on a pair of tracksuit pants with elasticated waist, or I start investigating.
Yes.
And I loved that, and that really stuck in my mind. I don't know if you remember having that conversation, but it was just one of those things which was like, yeah, wow, we can so easily just go on that slope of, well, I'm at this age, I can't change, my life's always going to look like this. But actually, that's what I'd love to talk about is the not knowing where this would go. It was just you wanted to write something, so a blog would be interesting, and there you go. And how many followers have you got at the moment?
On Instagram, it's nearly 30,000. So which I'm pleased about. It's taken many years to achieve that number. But yes, I think when I was wondering what to write about on the blog, I thought through all my interests like cycling and whatever. But then somebody said to me, well, why not write about something that directly concerns you, directly affects you? And of course, we all have quite a number of issues that directly affect us. And I thought, well, you know, as an older man, I sometimes wonder what I should be wearing and whether I can wear a t-shirt and whether I can wear jeans and where I can buy clothes that would suit me. So I thought that for a few weeks I would write about that until I'd found something more interesting to write about. This was in December 2011 I started the blog. And shortly after starting it, it was very lucky really, because Polly Vernon, who writes for The Times, somehow discovered the blog. she wanted to do a piece for the Times magazine one Saturday, and she interviewed me. And there was a sort of 5 or 6 page spread on the Times magazine one Saturday. Are you a grey fox? Which was all about older man's style and based heavily on the content of the blog at that time. And that sort of boosted my following, exponentially overnight. And I thought, well, perhaps I'd better continue this a little bit longer before finding something else to write about. And then it sort of went on like that, from episode to episode until here I am 8.5 years later, still writing the blog and haven't really sort of found anything else to write. But yes, the idea was that I think we all, whether we're men or women, get to an age where we're not quite sure how we should be dressing, and we maybe look at ourselves and think, well, I've had that suit for years and I haven't really sort of taken my style on to another level. And I just thought it might be quite interesting to look at all that and write about it. And the blog is sort of subtitled My Search for Style. So it was all about a search, and that's what I've tried to talk about in the blog and latterly in Instagram, of course, because Instagram was very much in its infancy when I started, and it wasn't for a couple of years till I really got going on Instagram. And now I would think probably most of the work is Instagram. I'm reluctant to give up the blog because I like the writing.
Yes.
But I think that Instagram is going to come and go, whereas blogs will probably sort of always be around in some form or another.
And sometimes people want to read a longer piece anyway, don't they?
Yes, yeah. I think that's right. And the two can be made to work together. So, Instagram is much more pictorial, if you like. And you can sort of, in very short format and pictorial format, cover the same sort of issues that you might be covering in a little bit more detail verbally on the blog.
Yes. And one of the things that I really love that I've seen more and more that you've been doing over the years is pushing for well-made, British-made, and I know a lot of your tweed stuff from, heading up to Scotland and just really pushing that side of things, I think has been really good. So it's not disposable fashion, but we're looking at sustainability, and I think that's so important.
Yes, that's been interesting. When I started off, I thought, well, I better start looking around for clothes that would be suitable for me, that I might like and which I feel comfortable in as an older man, although being older or younger is not particularly relevant to that, but it's just trying to find clothes that I like to wear. And I was amazed to discover that there are still a lot of clothes made in this country, in the UK. I'd assumed that all that had disappeared in the 70s, 80s, 90s, as companies moved out and started to manufacture in Asia. So I found a lot of these businesses. I also discovered a lot of young entrepreneurs every year starting businesses, making clothes, making leather bags. People in their 20s, really young people nowadays seem to be prepared to go out there and stick their necks out and start businesses of that sort. And I just find that so impressive that I try and I not only like British clothes, I like the quality and the way they're made, but I like the way that young people are displaying these entrepreneurial skills and getting out there and trying to make something that we'd all like to wear.
Yeah. No, I think that's wonderful, but also I think as well, yeah, it's great to see the young people doing that, but I also think that it's us of our generation and, sort of from midlife on. In fact, I read something recently that it's women so I'm in my late 50s, it's women of my generation that are the ones setting up all the businesses at the moment, which I think is really interesting.
Yes.
So again, it's not getting that, oh, well, I can't do anything now because I'm this age.
No.
And I think that's inspiring.
No, I think looking at Instagram, you can see that reflected. There are a lot of older women in particular who are not only starting their own businesses, but also starting up a whole new wave of style and, getting out there and showing the way they can wear their clothes. There are men doing the same thing, but I think to a lesser extent. So it's wonderful to see that.
Yeah.
And then the other thing you mentioned earlier was this whole sort of sustainability issue. I think in talking about British products, I was really also talking about quality and buying fewer and better quality clothes, rather than just sort of going out into the high streets every Saturday and buying bags full of landfill. And so I've recently, as an influencer or a blogger, I sometimes think, well, here am I encouraging people to spend money. Is that a good thing? So I'm trying to balance that a bit now by talking about sustainability, and most recently I've been looking at vintage, for example.
And sashiko and visible mending, which is something that I was absolutely thrilled to see that. So people might be wondering what the hell we're talking about right now, but you know, I'm a dressmaker. I learned dressmaking from my mum when I made all my own clothes when I was a teenager, and into my 20s I made my children's clothes, and then that's when the cheap clothes came in from, that's when everybody was outsourcing to China and places where fashion then became disposable. I remember going to John Lewis as a teenager, so coming up from Wales to go to John Lewis on Oxford Street, and the fabric department was that, apart from the cosmetics right at the front of the store, the back of the store, of the whole of the downstairs of John Lewis was fabric.
Yes.
And we'd come up to buy fabric to make clothes for the season, let's say, or the year, or whatever it was. And then it became a tiny little back room somewhere on the second floor. But what I love now is that I've gone back to making my clothes again. And I've kind of made a decision since lockdown that I'm not going to buy it. And maybe the odd t-shirts and things, but I'm going to make my clothes now. And I think that's a move if we can teach about, you know, even, as you say, buying bags of landfill. I've never heard it quite like that. And I think that's so, but it's so true.
It's true, yes.
We can't afford to do that anymore.
No. The problem is, of course, that the high street brands have to do that to survive. So it's in I think it's up to us as consumers to stop buying from them, or in some way to force them to approach life in a more sustainable way. And I notice some of them now start to wear what they call vintage, they're sort of used clothes as well as part of their sort of range. And some now offer repair services and so on. And that's all going in the right direction. But I accept there's always going to be a section of society that is not going to be able to afford high quality, expensive clothes. But the amount of rubbish that goes, you know, out of shops' doors every Saturday on the high streets is scandalously high. And that needs to change. You know, those brands either need to slim themselves down, work in a different way, or disappear. And it's in our hands as consumers to help that change, because I don't think the companies which are driven by profit are going to do it themselves. So that's why we need to start talking about repairing clothes, buying vintage, making our own clothes, and so on.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I feel really passionate about that, because you've just got to look, you know, and again, I'm a charity, vintage, whatever, charity shop. I love going in and rooting through, but some stuff is unworn, that's come from people have just bought something that's cost £2, £3, whatever, and they don't wear it. And so it's about education as well, but I think it's about educating people about, well, who's making these clothes?
Yes.
And how much are they getting paid to make those clothes, and the conditions that they were, and that needs to be, and it's getting better, but that needs to be front and center in the message coming out.
There's a reason why a t-shirt costs £3.99 at Uniqlo or wherever it is, and that's that somebody has been paid very poorly for it. Because if you think it's probably been made in Asia, it's been flown halfway around the world, and there's all those transport costs. Somebody's been paid very, very little to make that t-shirt. And those of us who can afford better clothes should be buying them, because they will be, on the whole, made by producers who look after their work as well. But going back to sashiko, I'm trying to teach myself to sew so I can use sashiko, because I just love the way that you can take an old pair of jeans or a jumper or something with moth holes in it, or wear holes, and repair them in a way that is really quite artistic. And yet the whole sort of basis of sashiko isn't that the repair is perfect. It's that you're actually seeing some beauty in imperfection and repair and in patches and that sort of thing, which is perfect for me because I can't sew for toffee. But you know, if I can make something look reasonably sort of artistic and nice, then I will do that. And that's the way we can actually save a pair of jeans.
Yes.
And not throw them away.
No, exactly. And I think that's where it's really, you know, thinking about your platform, and I love it that you know, you're an influencer, and how cool is that? 65, you know, you as a lawyer 25 years ago, I bet you weren't thinking about that, you know. But it's using our platform for good, isn't it? You know, as well. And I was delighted when I saw that, because I've been mending stuff for a long time, and I've always loved embroidery, and I've loved the Japanese embroidery as well, and using it as mending.
Yes. What's interesting is you can look around on Instagram and you suddenly realize that the whole world out there of people doing this and that, and you start to follow them, and I suppose as an Instagram person with a reasonable following, I can then help to get their message out there. So I hate the term influencer, but you know, there's no doubt that to an extent I do have responsibilities in that regard. But the other nice thing about doing what I'm doing now, as opposed to being a lawyer, is that my children think it's quite cool as well. So, so that's a great change. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly.
But you know, I think what's interesting is, you know, if I look back, what started all this off was this major cycling accident I had. You know, if I hadn't had that, I sometimes wonder whether I would have just sort of continued in a rather boring job, you know, and inertia would have sort of prevailed, or whether something else might have happened that might have sort of projected me into a new life. Because in a way, it's quite hard to make a decision to get to change things unless there's some sort of external influence, I would imagine. In my case, there was that external influence.
Yeah, and it's interesting with a lot of my coaching work. It is that, and one of the things that I always say is, you know, why do we wait for something major to happen, a big life event to happen before we make changes in our life? And there's a wonderful poet, Mary Oliver, who died last year before, who I love, American poet, and one of her lines in one of her poems was, "Tell me what it is you'll do with this one wild and precious life of yours." So I kind of paraphrased, but it's that, isn't it? We've got this one life, one wild and precious life, and why are we waiting until something major happens for us to actually do what we want to do, live in a different way, rather than carrying the weight of, you know, well, I did the studying, so I've got to stick at this.
Yes.
And something that I share with my children.
Yes. And that thought often occurs to me as well. And in some ways, I find frustrating sort of society's attitude towards older people, because we do have the sort of experiences that enable us to think sensibly about issues like that, and yet somehow you're sort of swept into the corner. You know, I find even with the blog, and despite the sort of size of, I suppose, if you like, the influence I have as an Instagrammer and a blogger, brands still probably tend to tiptoe around me in a way that they wouldn't if I was 30 years old. And that's despite the sort of economic power of our demographic. You know, we spend a lot more money than any other group on luxury items, on fashion and so on. And yet for some reason, the fashion industry sort of to an extent ignores us. And I do not understand that.
Yeah. It's so interesting, isn't it? And certainly with everything that's going on in the world at the moment, so many groups that, you know, the fashion industry, I think, has got an awful lot to answer for. Whether it's ageism, whether it's racism,
Yeah.
that it's just appalling. And I think I hope, maybe I'm naive, but I hope that we're waking up to all of this now and just will not tolerate it any longer.
No, I think that's probably right. I think recent events show that people are beginning to become more aware of their own power. And I think over the last sort of 10 years, social media has given the ordinary person power. And often that power has perhaps been misdirected and hasn't worked particularly well. You look at some large Western countries and their leaders, and you think, how they're probably there as a result of the power of sort of social media in some ways. But I think properly directed, it does mean that change can be made to happen. But it's up to us, as I was saying earlier, like as consumers of fashion on the high street, it's up to us to make those changes, because the businesses aren't going to do it themselves.
No, exactly. And it's interesting because in fact, it was last night that we did, Four Women, Four Decades, we did our event on confidence and self-esteem. And actually, one of the things that we were saying is that our confidence is within us anyway. So if we can just discard what I call the unreliable narrator, that voice that's saying, oh no, but I can't, I'm just little Joe Blogg, so I can't have an impact, blah, blah, blah. It's just like, you don't need to listen to that, just if it feels right, then do it, whatever your age, and just.
I don't know if you disagree with this, but I think that's often, I think one often sees that in women, in older women in particular. I mean, men just tend to sort of bluster through life anyway, don't they? Am I being unfair here?
Well, I don't know, but what's interesting is that, obviously with Four Women, Four Decades, we're speaking to women, but also hopefully in men that are ready to listen as well.
Yeah. Yes.
And I know that
often aren't ready to listen.
Yeah, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because I remember you saying, and I don't know whether this has changed, that the majority of your following is female.
No, not the majority. 20% is female.
Oh, that's wonderful.
1 in 5. Yes.
Yes. Yeah. So that's good.
Yes, that is good. Yes.
Because hopefully they are beginning to listen to whatever it is you're saying.
Yeah.
Well,
It's interesting, isn't it? I think of course, I don't really know why people follow me, and I'd love to be able to do so, but I assume that a lot of people follow me because they like to get ideas for how they might dress and where they might buy their clothes and so on. But whether that's the case or not, I just don't know. And whether that comes out of confidence issues, or I don't know. Hopefully people are just beginning to older people in particular, just beginning to realise that there is a life out there beyond cardigans and slippers, and that retirement, older age brings huge opportunities, and to dress better, to get out there and travel, to do all sorts of wonderful things. And that's one of the blessings for me of the blog and of Instagram, is that I've just been able to sort of explore these things.
Absolutely. And one of the things that you'd said, I'm just looking down here at my notes, is that it's never too late to change direction, career and interest. And I love that that's one of the things that clearly you're, hopefully with your following, are pointing to that as well. That because I think, again, we are all living so much longer. And if we've got that mindset of, well, certainly retiring at 67 seems kind of, well, yes, absolutely. If you've been in a very manual job that's hugely demanding or whatever, then yes, retirement. But for me, that doesn't mean sitting down with pipe and slippers, does it? No. It's like, so what do I want to do next? And maybe it's something creative, or just allowing your mind to think creatively.
Yes,
something else.
On from one thing to another. Retirement potentially. I think I still come across people who are retiring, and I say, well, what are you going to do? And they say, oh, I don't really know. And I think that's a shame, because we all have interests we can develop, or we can look around and find new interests that we haven't even thought we'd like to try.
Yeah.
You know, there's just so much going on out in the world that we could get involved in, from politics through the arts, you know, whatever. There's always going to be something for everybody. Yeah. And retirement gives you the time to do that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely.
And I think, you know, I think there tends to be this view that older people become less creative and less imaginative. And I think that's actually not the case at all. I think if you'd asked me 10 years ago, I would have agreed with that. But, you know, once you've got the time to look around and see exactly what is going on out there and read and follow people on Instagram, then you realise that the opportunities are just absolutely infinite, you know, endless, but for what we could get involved in, what we could do. And that includes being creative.
And it's a choice, isn't it? You know, again, it's that whole mindset of, well, you know, I'm this age and that's it now, downhill. I remember speaking to somebody quite a while ago about her aunt. So somebody my age who was talking about her aunt who had retired in she turned 50. Okay, she turned 50 and sat in a chair and didn't leave that chair till she was 80 when she died. And it was just, goodness me.
Such a waste, isn't it?
Such a waste. Such a waste. And there we are, dog.
Hello, Harry.
And lovely wife. And I just think that's it. You know, I was thinking about my grandfather who died when he was 95. He'd be about 111 now, I think. But he was busy reading and writing right up until he died, really.
Yeah. Yes.
You know? And there's my dad, 88, and still swinging a golf club and just learning about, well, this lockdown has meant that he's had to get to grips with his iPad and a bit of technology, you know.
Yeah. So yes, external circumstances have sort of forced a
exactly.
Yes, I think, you know, the opportunities are just endless, and it's just a question of almost having the imagination to get out there and find out what they are. But it is very sad to hear of 50-year-olds who that's it, and they sit down until they die.
That was a couple of generation or so ago, hopefully. But
I think that is probably less likely to happen now, isn't it? You know, I think back to my own grandparents at the age I am now. It probably was very much slippers and cardigans. Yeah. But now, I couldn't imagine my grandfather jumping on his bike every other day, or you know, being a blogger or an Instagrammer. Okay, those things didn't exist, but you know.
But the equivalent.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, I have loved this conversation, David. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Rebecca. It's been lovely to have a chat, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this.
Yeah, no, I'm sure that it'll resonate with people and that watch our channel and everything. So that's really good. Thank you. And what I'll do is in the notes below on YouTube, I'll put a link to your blog and to your Instagram channel.
Thank you very much.
So yeah, so that's lovely. So thank you everyone for watching. This is one of our life lesson conversations for 4 Women, 4 Decades. We would do leave comments in the notes below, and do subscribe to our channel, because we've got lots of other great interviews that are live at the moment. So thanks so much, and see you again next time.